Hi, welcome to Threads of Scarlet. I'm Kelsey, and on this channel, we share stories from the Bible that point to the redemption of Jesus Christ. Today, I'm talking about the book of Ruth, which is all about redemption. What some may not know is that there are actually 3 redeemers in this story. In our talk today, I'm heavily drawing from a Tim Keller sermon called An Immigrant's Courage, which will be linked below. For those who may not know the story well, here's a short summary of what happens in the book of Ruth. It tells the story of an Israelite family who moves to Moab during a famine. The father dies as well as his 2 sons, leaving 3 widows, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem and urges her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, but Ruth famously refuses and pledges loyalty to Naomi and to Israel's God. In Bethlehem, Ruth provides for them by gleaning leftover grain in the fields, where she meets Boaz, a relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz is kind to Ruth and then eventually marries her as a kinsman redeemer, and through their family line comes King David and eventually Jesus the Messiah. It's a story of loyalty and redemption. Before we dig in, let me set the stage. Ruth takes place during the period of the Judges, a spiritually chaotic time. It says in Judges 17 verse 6, "Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Israel had no guiding king, and they were constantly turning from God. It was also a time of major contention between the Moabites and Israelites. During Israel's wilderness journey, Moab had drawn Israel into idolatry, among other things, which soured their relationship with the Moabites. So when Ruth, a Moabite, walks into Bethlehem, she's stepping into a culture where she would not have just been an outsider, but an enemy. That's what makes Ruth's faithfulness and Boaz's kindness to her so beautiful in light of all this. So with that context, why did Ruth so drastically leave her family, religion, and safety to follow Naomi and serve God rather than the gods of her past faith? Well, it seems like Ruth's decision wasn't practical, but rather profoundly spiritual. Ultimately, it came down to her friendship with Naomi. Naomi's life and faithfulness, even in hardship, must have been so intriguing to Ruth to want the same hope she had in her God. The God of Israel was a living God who promised a covenant with his people, and that was quite different from the gods of her people. Ruth must have believed this God was worth leaving everything for. In her famous words, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God," she shows an incredible leap of faith. Ruth didn't leave to a new country for a better life. Rather, she left knowing she would have a harder life in Bethlehem as a foreigner whose people were hated there. But she knew that Naomi most likely wouldn't make it on her own. Ruth essentially decided to sacrifice potentially her life for Naomi's. She wasn't just following Naomi, she was entrusting her life to the Lord. It was an act of total faith, not convenience. Ruth chose the God who gives life over the gods who gave nothing in return. Naomi changed her name to Mara, meaning bitter, which makes it seem like she was rejecting God. But someone struggling with hopelessness can find encouragement from her perspective. Naomi wasn't rejecting God, rather wrestling with him. She still believed he was sovereign. She just didn't understand his ways. Calling herself Mara was her way of admitting her grief honestly. The beauty of the story is that God doesn't rebuke her for this. Instead, he patiently works behind the scenes to restore her joy. Naomi's story shows us that God's grace is bigger than our perspective. He meets us in our pain and patiently restores what's broken. Naomi thought the story was over, but God was just beginning. Let's talk about Boaz. In light of the cultural climate, his kindness to Ruth was surprising. In that culture, a foreign widow had almost no protection or worth. Many landowners would have ignored her or worse, exploited her. Boaz does none of that because God must have been at work in him. Boaz knew God's law, which calls Israel to care for foreigners and the vulnerable. He saw Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and recognized the hand of God in her life. Boaz reflects God's own character. He is a redeemer of the broken. In the book of Ruth, Boaz is called a kinsman redeemer. But what exactly is that? Well, a kinsman redeemer was a male relative who had the legal right and responsibility to protect a family's name and inheritance when tragedy struck. He could buy back land, rescue a family from poverty, or marry a widow to preserve the family line. When Boaz agrees to marry Ruth, He's restoring Naomi's family inheritance. He willingly pays the price, takes on the responsibility, and redeems and protects not just Ruth's future, but Naomi's as well. It's a beautiful picture of sacrificial love. But what many may not realize is that the book of Ruth portrays three redeemers. Let's talk about the second, who is Ruth herself. We have to remember that Ruth left her country to a new land, not for a better life. Rather, she knew she would have a harder life. Why would anyone do that willingly? Ruth must have known that if both her and Naomi traveled to Bethlehem, Naomi might survive there. But if Ruth hadn't gone on with her, Naomi most likely would have died, a lonely widow with no money or way to provide for herself. Ruth redeemed Naomi's life at the cost of leaving hers behind, sacrificing everything for her. And Ruth ultimately redeemed Naomi by her marriage and future grandson who carried on the family line, and by Boaz buying back her land. But there's a third redeemer in this story, and this the most important. It says in Ruth 4:14, "Then the women said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel.'" As Tim Keller points out in his sermon on this, Boaz was already renowned and had a name, so the child it's referring to is the child of promise, Jesus Christ, who fulfills and surpasses the pattern we see in Ruth and Boaz as redeemers. Jesus is the redeemer to whom Boaz and Ruth ultimately point. Like Ruth, Jesus left his home, leaving heaven itself to come to a broken world, entering into our story. Like Boaz, Jesus paid our debt, fully, sacrificially, willingly. Everything he has becomes ours, his righteousness, his inheritance. Like Boaz covering Ruth with his garment, Jesus covers us with his grace, calls us his own, and brings us into his family forever. Jesus is the Redeemer of redeemers. At this point, it would be tempting to just look at Boaz and Ruth as an example to follow, but we can't just emulate them. That expectation alone would be crushing. We wouldn't have the strength to be like them when things go horribly wrong. We have to remember that God is overcome with love by us, that we're absolutely cherished and accepted by him right now, without anything we can do. And only after we grasp that can we have the same redeeming power that Boaz and Ruth tapped into. We'll finally live out a newfound joy and peace to sustain us through the ups and downs. I'd love to know what stands out to you most in the book of Ruth. How has it impacted your life? Leave your comment below, and I look forward to chatting with you. Join us next time for another story from the Bible that portrays the scarlet thread of redemption.